Hey guys, happy Wednesday and welcome back to We're Fucked Until We're Not, a podcast talking about all things climate change for 15 minutes or less. I think environmental education has been a little too kumbaya lately, and while I love optimism, I think we need to be a little more straight up about the problems and solutions related to climate change. And that's what we're here for. I'm your host, MK, and I'll be doing this every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern. Before we go ahead, feel free to give us a follow on any of our social media channels. We're on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, but if you aren't really active on social media and still want to reach out, then you can always shoot us an email. I'll put all the links in the description below. I really do appreciate all the engagement that's come our way on social media, whether it's been questions or comments or constructive feedback. I think it's really great to see people listening to what we're putting out, and considering this podcast is only about a month old, it's been amazing to see how many listeners we've got, and it's been a great time overall. Now let's get to it. This week, we'll be talking about geoengineering. I originally was going to save this for a later episode, but a few people DM me on Instagram saying that they thought that the geoengineering project in the Arctic I touched upon last week was really cool. If you want more context, in the interest of time and more so in the interest of plugging my other episodes, if you want to hear more about that, I highly recommend you listen to last week's episode after this one. The principle behind geoengineering is that as time goes on, more and more technology is being developed and innovated, and we should be applying that to climate action as well. That case gets built even further when we see that we aren't really meeting any of our climate goals, and at this rate we'll probably hit that 2 degrees Celsius tipping point that scientists and ecologists and pretty much the whole world is super worried about. Because here's the thing, I know people are already hating the idea just hearing it, but we aren't exactly going to hit our emissions targets and temperature targets without it. Developed countries just aren't decreasing their emissions enough, and that increased nationalism and conservatism the last decade definitely didn't do us any favors. So basically, we're not going to solve this climate change issue unless we have some form of geoengineering. Today, we'll cover the two major kinds of climate engineering, which are carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management. Let's start with carbon dioxide removal. So kind of like the name suggests, carbon dioxide removal, and we'll call that CDR for short, involves removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere so that the parts per million count decreases, hopefully by a lot. Ideally, this would help remove some of that excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and help us meet our temperature targets that reducing emissions alone won't do. One way of doing this is called carbon capture and storage, or CCS, and that's where we take carbon dioxide from the air and transport it, whether it's through a ship or a pipeline, and store it underground in old geological formations. And according to the International Energy Agency, last year we already applied this to 40 million metric tons of carbon, and it'll only increase from here. It lets us create that concept of negative emissions, which is where a company or a firm or a country has actually taken out more carbon from the atmosphere than they've put out. And the IEA showed that with costs going down and the need for this going up, there's already been 30 CCS facilities announced in the last 3 years, with most of them being in the US and Europe, which would capture over 130 million metric tons of carbon, as opposed to the 40 million that was captured last year. A lot of people studying it had wondered if the crisis and recession with COVID-19 had changed anything, but projections seem to be more or less the same, meaning that carbon dioxide removal is still a really high priority to these countries. And the best part about it is that it's pretty safe and effective. Storing billions of tons of carbon dioxide underground can help, and it also proves that large amounts can be stored underwater or underground, and there won't be any significant leakage for thousands and thousands of years. I know that whole thousands of years part kind of seems like a band-aid, but this is a very immediate threat, and this is an easy way out of it. But not all kinds of CDR involve that kind of high-tech setup you're probably thinking of, because I know some people are still kind of iffy about technology being used to that extreme. So the alternative to that is called nature-based CDR, which involves more natural ways of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The two most popular ways of doing this are just by massively planting rainforests and trees, which people, especially in Asia, are doing an amazing job of, or there's also people in communities restoring wetlands, which helps to cut down emissions and also help increase biodiversity, or at least help prevent a lot of endangered species from going extinct. We'll talk about the other kind of climate engineering in just a second. While we're on the topic of sponsorships, I wanted to say that 20% of anything that's made on this podcast will be donated to a new climate action organization every single month. I'll also talk about them on our social media channels, so you guys can also donate if you'd like. So this month, it'll be with the Indigenous Environmental Network, and 20% of what we make will go right to them. I prefer these kind of smaller organizations over the massive ones because these really, really big environmental organizations, while they have good intentions, they spend a lot of money on publicizing and advertising, and I'd rather the money go straight to climate action. So more grassroots, or at least smaller organizations, spend less money on advertising and marketing, and that way they can help address the problem right at the source. Back to climate engineering, if you thought CDR was some really high-tech stuff, just wait till you hear about this. Solar radiation management, or SRM for short, is where we reflect some sunlight back out, kind of like the albedo that we talked about in last week's episode. But in this case, instead of it being ice, the plan is to inject sulfate aerosols, or other kinds of similar particles, straight into the atmosphere, which by nature reflect back some of the light and heat that comes in. Now you might be worried about sulfates just being put into the atmosphere, but this is something that already happens naturally in the form of volcanic eruptions. Actually, when Mount Pinatubo erupted back in 1991, which was one of the largest eruptions of the last century, scientists measured a drop in the average global temperature of a little over half a degree Celsius, or just about 1 degree Fahrenheit. So if we do this at a very controlled level every year, we'd be able to lower than maintain the average temperature in theory. And the best part about it is that it's super cheap. It's estimated to cost only about $10 billion a year worldwide. That sounds like a lot of money, but considering that the global GDP is over 80 trillion US dollars, this is basically next to nothing. But there's a catch. There just hasn't been enough research done, so it's not like we'll be implementing it anytime soon. But Harvard's taking a lot of initiative and has their own geoengineering research program, and they're actually leading a large-scale experiment for the first time to see just how feasible SRM really is. And, hopefully we'll see some good results and see it implemented sooner rather than later. But that's not the only hurdle that we have to cross thus far. We also run the risk of what's called termination shock, which is what happens when the support system suddenly fails. What happens if there's another COVID-19 type crisis, or the technology just fails somehow? And we've been doing this for a few years. Temperatures can suddenly skyrocket, and that can mean the worst for many people, plants, animals, and ecosystems all around. We also have to see who's in charge of it. How do we know a country with that much power won't really use this in the wrong way? And more importantly, how do we know that they won't use it to hold the global economy hostage, which is an extreme thought, but you have to keep that in mind, with leaders becoming more and more unstable, or more fringe leaders being elected, this is always a possibility that we have to be wary of. Then, not only who's in charge of it, there's also the issue of who exactly pays for it. Sure, $10 billion a year isn't exactly a ton of money, especially for a lot of developed countries, but countries towards the right side of the political spectrum might not want to put that money up, even if they're the ones that brought us into this mess into the first place. There's a lot of issues as a whole with international climate change politics and accountability, but I'll go over all of that in a later episode. Representation is actually another big issue. Say countries greenlight this even though they know there's kind of a risk of termination shock, people living in coastal areas are going to be really, really badly affected if things go wrong, and they don't get the kind of climate representation that they need. SRM definitely seems to be really, really cool if we can figure it out, but there's just a lot of hurdles that'll have to be passed through before we can get into that. I know climate engineering as a whole is pretty controversial, so I'd love to hear what people's opinions are about the different kinds of climate engineering and if we should go forward with it or not, or if you think that we can do it in a limited use where some forms of climate engineering can be used and we should be leaving some others out. Definitely feel free to reach out to us on social media or email us, and like I said earlier, they're all linked below. And it's not just about geoengineering, but if you want any more resources or information, or you've magically fallen in love with the host of the podcast, don't hesitate to reach out, and I love seeing what every single person has to say. I'll see you guys next Wednesday.